The bank statement arrived on a Tuesday, and Reginald Faulkner read it 3 times before his hands stopped moving. $47,000. Gone. Withdrawn in careful, deliberate amounts over the past 9 months, each one just small enough to avoid triggering an automatic alert. The man who had spent 20 years auditing municipal infrastructure budgets for the city of Ottawa had not noticed his own savings account being hollowed out from beneath him. He set the paper on the kitchen counter and stood there in the November dark, listening to the furnace push warm air through the vents of a house that no longer felt like his. For 17 years, this house on Ambleside Drive in Barhaven had been the physical center of everything Reginald Faulkner believed in. A marriage that worked. A daughter who was becoming someone remarkable. Sunday dinners with family. Shoveling the neighbor's walk without being asked. The quiet, repetitive acts of devotion that do not make for dramatic stories but do make for a life worth defending. His wife's name was Camille. She taught grade 6 at Stonecrest Public School and had a way of making 11-year-olds feel like the most important people in any room. Their daughter, Zara, was 15 and already taller than her mother, with a laugh that could shift the temperature of the entire house. But for the past 9 months, the temperature had dropped. Camille had become someone Reginald could see but not reach. The goodbye kisses at the front door vanished first, then the conversations after dinner, then the laughter. She started sleeping in the basement guest room, claiming her back needed the firmer mattress. She stopped attending Zara's volleyball games, stopped asking about his day at the office. Her phone, which had always lived face up on the kitchen counter, now traveled with her from room to room, screen down, always within arm's reach, and now $47,000. Reginald was not a man who arrived at conclusions quickly. His entire career was built on gathering data before making a single recommendation. He inspected bridge footings, water treatment systems, foundation pours. He understood that the thing you see on the surface almost never tells the full story. But 9 months of silence and distance, followed by a number that large disappearing without explanation, had brought him to the edge of the only conclusion left. His wife was leaving, or gambling, or financing someone else's life, or all three. He had already spoken to a lawyer. The papers were in his briefcase, sitting in the trunk of his car in the garage. He had told no one except his older brother, Jerome, a high school guidance counselor in Gatineau, who had listened to the whole account over the phone without interrupting, and then said very carefully, "Reggie, before you hand her anything, make sure you're reacting to what's real, not what you've built in your head." Reginald had promised to think about it. Then he had signed the papers anyway. Tonight, he planned to hand them over. One final conversation, then the envelope. That was the plan. But the plan changed the moment he came through the side door. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, tap subscribe. The stories on this channel are built for people who have loved someone through silence and almost lost them. This one will take you somewhere you do not expect. Stay. He had come home early from a site inspection in Canada. The house was dark except for the light above the stove and the faint blue glow of a phone screen coming from the sunroom at the back of the house. Camille's voice carried through the half-open door. Low, unsteady. The voice of a person who had been crying for some time and was now simply too exhausted to stop. "Priya, I can't keep doing this. He's going to leave me. I can see it." Priya Chandrasekaran, Camille's closest friend since teachers' college. The name Reginald had seen on the phone bill more times than any other over the past 9 months. The name that had fed his worst suspicions, not because Priya was a threat, but because constant, secretive calls to anyone suggested a life being lived outside his knowledge. "The last round nearly broke me," Camille said. "I threw up in the staff bathroom 3 times on Thursday and told Sandra it was a stomach bug. I don't know how much longer I can hide this." Reginald stood absolutely still in the hallway, his coat still on, his briefcase still in his hand. The briefcase with the divorce papers inside it. "Stage 2 cervical cancer," Camille whispered. 9 months. I've been doing treatment at the Ottawa hospital every second Tuesday. Priya, I sold the bonds, all of them. That's where the money went. The insurance wouldn't cover the clinical trial, and I couldn't let him find out because— her voice broke entirely. Because his mother died of it. The same cancer. 3 years ago. I watched what that did to him, Priya. I watched him sit in that hospice room every single day for 4 months and come home looking like someone had taken a piece of him and not given it back. I could not be the reason he went through that again. I could not let him look at me and see her. The briefcase made a small sound against his leg as his grip loosened. Every theory he had constructed over 9 months, every late-night accounting of withdrawals, every cold reading of her distance as evidence of betrayal, collapsed in the space between one breath and the next. His wife had not been leaving. She had not been gambling. She had not been building a secret life with someone else. She had been dying, quietly, privately, with the kind of fierce, misguided devotion that looks like abandonment from the outside but is, from the inside, the most desperate act of love a person can perform. Reginald set the briefcase on the hallway floor without a sound. He walked back through the side door, crossed the driveway, sat down on the cold concrete step of the garage, and pressed both hands against his face in the November dark while his breath came in sharp, ragged pulls that he could not control. He cried for every morning he had interpreted her exhaustion as indifference. For every evening he had read her silence as rejection. For every night he had lain awake doing the mathematics of suspicion, while the truth, enormous and terrifying and rooted entirely in love, was unfolding in the same house, behind a closed door, without him. Let's pause here, because what Reginald had been living through for the past 9 months has a clinical name. Ambiguous loss, developed by family researcher Dr. Pauline Boss. It describes the particular agony of losing someone who is still physically present. The person is there, at the table, under the same roof. But emotionally, they have become unreachable. The cruelty of ambiguous loss is that it cannot be grieved in the usual way. You cannot mourn someone who is standing in front of you. So, the mind, in the absence of real information, manufactures an explanation. For Reginald, that manufactured explanation was betrayal. The phone calls, the secrecy, the money. Each detail slotted neatly into a narrative his fear had already written. And once suspicion takes root, it does not respond to reassurance. It feeds on silence. This connects to a second pattern, the demand-withdraw cycle. One partner, sensing distance, begins to pursue, asks more questions, watches more closely. The other, overwhelmed by the secret they are carrying, pulls further away. Each withdrawal triggers a harder push. Each push triggers a deeper retreat. From the outside, it looks like a marriage disintegrating. From the inside, it is two people trapped in the same loop, each one's behavior producing the exact reaction they fear most. Camille's silence made Reginald more suspicious. His growing coldness made her retreat further into her secret. Neither of them knew they were caught in the cycle. That is what makes it quietly devastating. He sat in the garage until the cold made his knees ache. Then he went inside, moved through the dark house, stood outside the bedroom door, and listened to his wife's slow, depleted breathing. He did not open the door. He went to the kitchen table, sat in the chair he always sat in, and waited for the sky to change color. The next evening, Reginald came home at the usual time. Zara was in her room with her headphones on, working through something on her laptop. Camille moved through the kitchen with the careful economy of someone conserving energy for the next task. And the one after that, and the one after that. She had been moving that way for months. He had read it as disinterest. Now he understood it as endurance. She stopped when she saw him sitting at the kitchen table with his hands folded, watching her. Something crossed her face, fast and complicated. The expression of someone who has been bracing for a conversation they knew was coming and hoped never would. He kept his voice level, quiet, the voice of a man who has already done his crying alone and is now operating from whatever comes after. I heard your call with Priya last night. The color left her face. She reached for the edge of the counter and held on. Then she lowered herself into the chair across from him with the slow, deliberate motion of a person whose body has been through more than it can easily recover from. The tears came immediately. Not the controlled, private tears she had been managing for 9 months. These were the deep, shaking sobs of someone whose secret had finally become too heavy to hold. 9 months ago, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Right after your promotion, right after we finished clearing out your mother's things. She pressed both hands over her mouth. I couldn't tell you. You had just been named Director of Infrastructure. You were working 55-hour weeks. You were still visiting your mother's grave every Sunday morning. And she died of the same thing, Reggie. The same cancer. I watched you carry that for 2 years. I watched what it cost you. I could not be the thing that put you back in that place. There it is, the protector trap, one of the most well-documented and quietly destructive patterns in family psychology. It occurs when a person who loves deeply convinces themselves that hiding their suffering is a form of care, that enduring alone is the most generous thing they can offer. From inside, the logic feels noble. It feels like sacrifice. But what the research consistently shows is that hidden suffering does not remain hidden. It changes the atmosphere of a home. It alters posture, eye contact, tone of voice, responsiveness to touch. It does not vanish into silence. It transforms into the very damage the person was trying to prevent. Distance, withdrawal, suspicion, grief. Camille hid her illness because she loved Reginald with everything she had, and in doing so, she accidentally built every condition that nearly ended their marriage. Reginald did not speak for a long time. Then he asked, "Who else knows?" "Priya. She drove me to every appointment." "Your mother?" Camille looked down at her hands. "She knows." His jaw tightened. "Does Zara?" The pause told him everything. "She found out 2 months ago," Camille said softly. "She came home early from practice and found me in the bathroom after a treatment. I was on the floor. I couldn't get up." Her voice thinned. "She was so calm, Reggie. She helped me to bed. She brought me water. And then she sat on the edge of the mattress and asked me not to tell you because she said you'd already lost enough." A 15-year-old girl, carrying that alone, for 2 months. Reginald pushed his chair back and walked out of the kitchen, not in anger, in the sudden, overwhelming need to stand somewhere where the walls were not pressing in on him. He went to the garage, stood in the dark, breathed. Family therapists call it the family secret system. When a household faces crisis, especially one involving illness or shame, family members will sometimes organize themselves around a shared silence without ever formally agreeing to it. One person decides to protect the most vulnerable member. Another is brought in to help. Then another, and slowly, quietly, the family assembles around a sealed secret. The people inside the circle believe they are doing something loving. They are, in their way. But every person brought in absorbs a portion of the burden. And every person kept outside begins to feel the shape of something they cannot see. They do not know what is wrong. They only know that something is. And that formless anxiety is often more psychologically damaging than the truth would have been. Reginald had been the only person in his own family not trusted with the truth about his own family. Protected from something that belonged to him. That realization was going to require a great deal from everyone before it finally set them free. He called Jerome from the garage. "Brother," he said, and his voice carried everything. Jerome was quiet for a moment. "Tell me. Camille's been sick. 9 months. Cancer, I didn't know." A long exhale on the other end. Then Jerome said, carefully, "Reggie, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond. Say it." Maman Lucille knew. Camille called her the week after the diagnosis. She asked her to help keep it quiet, and Maman agreed. Maman Lucille, Camille's mother, the woman who had stood beside Reginald at his own mother's funeral and held his hand through the entire service without saying a word. The woman he trusted as deeply as anyone alive. "How do you know this?" Reginald asked. "Because Maman told me 3 weeks ago. She was breaking under the weight of it and needed someone outside the circle. She made me swear not to say anything." A pause. "I should have told you, Reggie. I know that. I've been carrying it since." The garage was completely silent except for the sound of the furnace cycling through the ductwork above. Two brothers on the phone, one in Ottawa, one across the river in Gatineau, sitting with the particular weight of a secret that had touched every person in this family, except the one it most belonged to. Reginald drove to Maman Lucille's apartment on Baseline Road. She opened the door before he finished knocking. She was already crying. Not the startled tears of someone caught off guard. The slow, steady release of a woman who had been preparing for this moment for months. "Come in, Manchu," she said. They sat at her kitchen table, the one with the pale blue cloth she never changed, because she said it reminded her of the St. Lawrence in summer. She folded her hands and did not wait for him to begin. "She was terrified you would leave," Maman Lucille said. "The way your father almost left your mother when she got the diagnosis. Camille has known that story since before you married her." It settled deep. The words landed with old weight. Reginald's father, a decent but frightened man, had nearly walked away when Reginald's mother was first diagnosed. He came back. He stayed until the end. But the fact that he had almost gone, that shadow had lived in this family for a long time. It had apparently lived inside Camille too. "She should have trusted me," he said. "I know. I told her so." Maman Lucille covered his hand with both of hers. But love does not always see clearly. She was fighting for her life and terrified of losing you at the same time. That is an enormous weight for one person. He drove home. It was past 10. The house was dark except for the light under Zara's door. He knocked softly and opened it. She was sitting cross-legged on her bed, textbook open, headphones around her neck. The moment she saw his face, her eyes filled. He sat on the edge of her bed, the way he had since she was small enough to curl in his lap. "Talk to me, Z." She told him in the measured, careful voice of a teenager who has been holding something far too heavy, that she had found her mother on the bathroom floor, gray-faced and shaking, that Camille had gripped her hand and said, "Your father has already buried one woman he loved. Please don't make him watch it happen again." That Zara had nodded and gone to her room and sat on the floor with her back against the door and cried without making a sound because she didn't want either of her parents to hear. "I didn't know what to do, Dad. I'm sorry." Reginald pulled his daughter into his arms and held on. "You don't owe me an apology, not one word." He held her until she stopped shaking, and sitting in the lamplight of his daughter's bedroom, surrounded by volleyball trophies and taped-up photographs and the small, ordinary evidence of a childhood that had been quietly disrupted. He understood the full architecture of what had been built inside this house without his knowledge. An entire family reorganizing itself around a single secret. Each member shielding him from the same truth. Each one, in love and in fear, cutting him off from the very people he would have moved the earth to protect. He went to the bedroom. Camille was sitting up, waiting. She had heard the car leave and return. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed. His voice cracked once. "You really thought I couldn't handle this?" "No." She shook her head. "I thought you could. That's what scared me. I knew you'd hold yourself together for me and for Zara. And I knew what it would cost you, because I watched it cost you everything with your mother. And you never complained once, and it took pieces of you that you still haven't gotten back." He looked at her for a long time, then very slowly, with the specific vulnerability of a person revealing the thing they have worked hardest to conceal, Camille reached up and removed the silk scarf she had taken to wearing constantly, claiming she liked the way it looked. Beneath it, her hair was thin, fragile patches where thick dark curls had been. New growth along her temples, soft and uneven. "I felt so changed," she whispered. "I didn't want you seeing me like this." Reginald broke. He pulled her close and held her face in both hands and let his own tears come without any effort to stop them. No composure, nothing held back. "You are still the most beautiful person I have ever known," he said. "Nothing about this changes that. Nothing." They held each other in the dark bedroom of the house on Ambleside Drive, while the furnace hummed and the November wind pressed against the windows, and 17 years of marriage bent under the weight of the truth and did not break. This is where a final psychological principle becomes visible. Silent strength syndrome. The deeply held belief, especially in families shaped by generational hardship, that showing vulnerability is equivalent to being weak, that a good partner endures privately, that the most loving thing you can do is suffer where no one can see. Camille hid her illness because she feared vulnerability would cost her the marriage. Reginald buried his pain because he believed a man holds things together without showing the strain. Both operating from the same inherited script, both suffering alone for the same reason: love. What broke the pattern was not confrontation. It was one man in a dim bedroom watching his wife remove her scarf and refusing to be strong at the expense of being honest. "I've been scared for 9 months," he said quietly, "and I didn't know how to say it." She leaned her forehead against his "me too." Then Camille's phone rang. She looked at the screen. Her hand went still. "It's Dr. Renaud." He nodded. She answered on speaker. They sat side by side on the edge of the bed. The doctor's voice was calm, precise, and carried everything in its first sentence. "Camille, I have your results from the latest scans. The treatment has been successful. You are in full remission." She folded forward, both hands pressed to her face, her shoulders shaking. Reginald wrapped his arms around her and held on, as if the act of holding was the only thing keeping him anchored to the floor. After a long time, she lifted her face and whispered against his chest, "I had a plan. If I made it through, I was going to ask you to start over. Do it right this time. No secrets, no silence." He looked at her. "Then that is exactly what we're going to do." They talked through the rest of the night, the real kind of talking. The kind that happens when the last wall has come down and there is nothing left to manage or protect. She told him about sitting alone in her car in the hospital parking garage after the first biopsy. The building she had driven past 1,000 times suddenly becoming the center of something enormous. She told him about calling Priya first because Priya was a nurse and could absorb the clinical reality without collapsing. Calling Maman Lucille second because Maman could carry grief and still keep moving. "Why not me?" he asked. Not an accusation, a genuine question. "Because with them, I could fall apart and put myself back together before anyone saw. But with you, I was afraid that if I came apart in front of you, I would never be able to put myself back together. Because watching you carry that pain would have hurt me more than the illness itself." "That makes sense," he said. "It doesn't mean it was right, but it makes sense." He told her, in return, what the past 9 months had looked like from his side. He did not spare the details: the suspicion, the phone bill, the attorney, the signed papers in his briefcase. He watched her face as he spoke, and he let her feel the full weight of it, not as punishment, because she deserved to know the cost of the silence the same way he now deserved to know the cost of hers. When he finished, she was quiet. Then she said softly, "There were nights I almost told you everything, not because I was ready, because I thought if I just let the distance grow, you'd eventually leave on your own, and it would be easier for you. A clean break, no hospital rooms, no hospice, no watching it happen again. A pause. But I couldn't, because I still loved you too much, and I was terrified that if you stayed, it would only be out of obligation. I could not live inside a marriage held together by pity. Two people, the same house, the same wound, approached from opposite sides, both so devoted to protecting the other that they had nearly destroyed the thing they were trying to save." The next morning, Reginald stood at the kitchen counter. Zara was at the table with her cereal, watching him carefully. Camille stood in the hallway in her robe, both hands around a mug, watching too. He opened his briefcase, took out the divorce papers, held them up long enough for both of them to see. Then he tore them in half, then in half again. He kept tearing until the pieces were too small to hold, and let them fall into the recycling bin. Zara was out of her chair before the last piece landed. She crossed the kitchen and threw her arms around both of her parents with the uncomplicated force of a 15-year-old who had been holding her breath for months and was finally allowed to exhale. "This is what it's supposed to feel like," she said muffled, into the middle of it. Camille laughed, a real laugh, full and open, the first one Reginald had heard in 9 months, and pressed her face into his shoulder. He held them both and looked up at the ceiling. No particular address for the gratitude, just gratitude, offered to whatever had kept this family intact long enough to reach this moment. The following Sunday, Reginald organized a gathering at their parish, Saint Anne, where Father Michel led a prayer of thanksgiving. Standing before the congregation, people who had watched this family grow, Reginald spoke honestly for the first time about what the past 9 months had truly been. "I almost walked away from my family," he said, "because I stopped listening. I was so certain I knew what was happening that I never once asked whether I might be wrong. I built a career on inspecting structures before they fail, and I let the most important structure in my life crack for 9 months without asking the right questions." He paused. "From now on, we carry things together. No more suffering alone. No more protecting each other with silence. That is not love. That is fear dressed up as love, and we are done with it." Camille sat in the front pew, tears running freely. Zara pressed against her mother's arm, watching her father with the expression of someone who understands, far earlier than any child should have to, what it costs to hold a family together. Maimon Lucille was at the end of the row in her good coat, quietly working through a tissue. Priya had given up on composure entirely and was not trying to hide it. Jerome sat with his arms crossed and his eyes bright, nodding slowly. Father Michel blessed them with the warmth of a man who knows the specific people he is praying for. He gave thanks for the remission, for the marriage that held, for a daughter who had carried more than any child should carry, and for parents who were now committed to making sure she never had to do that alone again. The congregation said amen in the way that means we have been pulling for you all along. What happened in that church illustrates something family psychology rarely gets to observe cleanly. A family moving from crisis into genuine restoration. The shift began when shame was replaced by shared responsibility. Not blame. Shared responsibility. There is a meaningful difference. Blame looks backward. Shared responsibility looks forward and asks, how do we carry this together from here? Reginald modeled it publicly, acknowledging his own part in the silence, his failure to press past assumption into honest conversation. That gave Camille permission to do the same, and her willingness to be fully seen gave Zara permission to put down the weight she had been carrying silently. Healing in families is rarely a single moment. It is a series of choices to keep choosing honesty over the comfort of distance. Healing looks like a season, not a moment. It looks like a Sunday dinner where everyone is actually present. A phone call that does not end when someone walks into the room. A woman who comes home from school at 4 o'clock with color in her face instead of arriving late, too hollowed out to speak. A man who comes to bed instead of lying awake, running numbers on everything that is broken. Over the weeks that followed, Reginald quietly liquidated a portion of his RRSP, absorbed the tax hit without complaint, and cleared Camille's entire treatment debt. He never brought it up at dinner. Never made her feel small about the bonds. He simply handled it and moved on, the way a person handles what they consider their responsibility. He also worked with the school board administration to restructure Camille's teaching schedule, reducing her to 4 days a week for the remainder of the year. She resisted at first. She had always been the teacher who arrived first and left last. But Reginald made the case over 2 evenings of quiet conversation. "I want you home for dinner," he said. "I want Zara to have her mother at the table. That is all I am asking." She agreed. The first Thursday she was home by 4:30, standing at the counter chopping peppers, while Zara did homework at the kitchen table just to be nearby. The three of them sat down together at 6. Actual dinner, not a covered plate in the oven. Zara looked around the table and said, with the directness only a 15-year-old can deliver without self-consciousness, "This is better." It was. Together, Reginald and Camille began counseling, with a family therapist, Jerome, recommended, not because the marriage was still in crisis, because they had both learned, at considerable cost, that love is not self-maintaining. It requires tending. It requires the willingness to say, "I am scared, and I am overwhelmed, and I need you," without those words feeling like failure. For two people raised to absorb difficulty without showing it, Learning to receive turned out to be the hardest and most important work of all. They invited Priya and Maman Lucille back to regular Sunday dinners. Those first gatherings were awkward. There were conversations that required courage to begin, but they began them anyway. The table got louder. The laughter came back. Zara started practicing her serves in the backyard again, which she had quietly stopped doing around month 4 of the silence. True forgiveness is not the erasure of pain. It is not performing warmth over unprocessed hurt. It is the decision to rebuild trust while fully acknowledging the cost. To say, this happened, it hurt, and I am choosing to move forward with you anyway. Couples who survive serious crises do so not because the pain disappears. They survive because both people make a daily, sustained commitment to transparency, to being seen fully by the one person they have most wanted to hide from. The cracks Reginald had once feared would bring the whole structure down had become, with patience and honest repair, the strongest points in the foundation. He knew this as an engineer. A properly repaired load-bearing joint often holds more weight than the original, because it has been examined, reinforced, and rebuilt with full knowledge of where the weakness lived. Their marriage was like that now. 6 months after that night in the garage, on a clear Saturday afternoon in late May, when the lilacs along the back fence were in full bloom, and the light came through the trees in that particular way it does in Ottawa. When spring has finally, fully arrived, Reginald and Camille Faulkner stood in their backyard and renewed their vows. It was small, the people who mattered. Father Michel presided with the warmth of a man who genuinely believes in the thing he is blessing. Maman Lucille had been at the house since morning, arranging flowers and overseeing the food with the quiet authority of a woman who considers hospitality a form of prayer. Priya had arrived early, cried twice before the ceremony, and showed no signs of stopping. Jerome stood to the side with his arms folded, nodding at everything. Zara stood beside her mother in a blue dress she had chosen herself, holding the rings with the careful solemnity of someone who understood exactly what they cost. Reginald held his wife's hands under the late afternoon light. Her hair was growing back, dark and healthy, catching the sun. He looked at her for a long time before he spoke. "I used to think you had stopped loving me," he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes were bright. "Now I know that you loved me so completely you were willing to carry all of it alone. The fear, the treatments, the cost, all of it, just to keep me standing. I am asking you, right here, in front of everyone who has ever loved us, to never do that again. Whatever comes next, we carry it together. That is the only foundation I want." Camille smiled through her tears. "Thank you for listening," she whispered. "And thank you for staying." Zara cheered loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Maman Lucille started the amen before Father Michel finished the blessing. Priya was already on her second borrowed tissue. The cancer was gone. The marriage had survived. The silence that had nearly consumed them had been replaced by something harder to build and infinitely more durable. Honesty, offered daily, imperfectly, without guarantee, and received with the kind of grace that only comes from knowing exactly how much it costs to go without it. But just when life had settled into something warm and whole, when the dinners were loud and the couch was for sitting, and Camille had taken to leaving a second coffee on the counter every morning, because she knew Reginald would be up before her, his phone buzzed late one evening. He was on the couch. Camille's head rested on his shoulder. The television was on low. She was almost asleep. It had been a long, ordinary good day, the kind he had stopped believing was possible somewhere around month 5 of the silence. The kind he had spent the last several months learning to trust again. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. A text. "Reginald, you still don't know the full truth about those 9 months. It wasn't only Camille's illness. There is something else your family has been keeping from you." He read it once, then again. He set the phone down slowly on the cushion beside him. Camille stirred at the shift in his posture. She lifted her head and found him looking at her with an expression she had not seen in months. Still, calm, reading. "What is it?" she asked softly. He held her gaze for a moment, then picked up the phone and let her see the screen. She read it. Her face went still. Her hand resting in his tightened slightly. Her smile, when it came back, arrived a half-second too late. Reginald turned off the screen. He did not set the phone down. He sat in the warm lamplight of the living room they had almost lost, in the house they had almost left, beside the woman he had almost walked away from. And he thought about foundations, about what holds, about the difference between a crack that has been properly repaired and one that has simply been covered over. He held her hand, and he wondered. This story reminds us that the most dangerous silence in a marriage is not the silence born of indifference. It is the silence born of love, the kind that means to protect but ends up isolating. The kind that says, I am carrying this so you do not have to, when what love actually requires is, I am carrying this and I need you beside me. We have watched the good men in our lives, our husbands, our sons, our brothers, carry burdens in silence that would have broken them if someone had not finally said, you do not have to hold this alone. And we have watched strong women bear their hardest seasons in private, convinced that asking for help was the same as giving something up. Reginald and Camille remind us that real love is not the absence of fear. It is the choice to speak through it. To say, I am scared and I am here, in the same breath. To build your foundation not around the cracks, but through them, with honesty and patience and the willingness to be fully seen by the one person who matters most. And if someone in your life has gone quiet in a way that worries you, a husband, a wife, a daughter, a friend, let this story be the reason you reach out tonight. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is simply refuse to let them disappear into their own silence. Like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Part 2 is coming. And what that message reveals will change everything you thought you understood about this family. Written from a human heart with AI's support. This story only hopes to send you a warm message. Kindness is never wasted, and even when the world feels harsh, there is always the light of justice and beautiful things quietly returning to those who are kind. Production team. Story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Nguyen. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Nguyen. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.